So this is Yumiko Asaya, manager of Japan Water Forum and also the Secretariat of the Asia Pacific Water Forum. Thank you so much for joining this session. This session is water security data going beyond the collection to match impact, convened by Asian Development Bank, International Water Center, and Asia Pacific Water Forum. This session is supposed to organize live session, but unfortunately, our schematic leader, Mr. Mark Pascoe, suddenly passed away 10 days ago, and his memorial just in parallel of this session, and most of the speaker of this session is attending his memorial. Hence, we conducted a pre-recorded session for this session. Apology if you are very, very looking forward to hearing your live discussion. We conducted the video, but we kindly we cordially appreciate your question, feedback, and comment anytime through this session time. And all speaker and panelists of this session will kindly respond to you after they come back from the memorial. So thank you so much for kindly listening to our pre-recorded session. The recording start.
Hi everyone, my name is Silvia Cardascia and I work as a water resources specialist at AWDO. It is a pleasure for me to participate virtually in World Water Week this year and talk about the 4th edition of the Asian Water Development Outlook 2020. AWDO, as we call it, is a flagship publication of ADB and the Asia Pacific Water Forum. It is quite a unique document because it assesses national water security across Asia and the Pacific, with a focus on key dimensions. They are 5: rural, economic, urban, environmental, and water-related disasters. AWDO is a living document that reflects evolving dynamics to track the region's water security. ADB published 2013, and 2016 AWDO editions, each building on the previous one to provide economic snapshots of Asia and the Pacific's water security status. Throughout the years, AWDO has expanded progressively in its scope and approach. Building on the past editions, AWDO 2020 has become a policy into praxis tool. First, it provides an up-to-date overview of the water security in the region, showing progress and enabling methodological comparison over time. Second, it allows spatial comparison across different scales, including ADB members and regions, by unpacking and disseminating scientific findings for larger audiences of policymakers, organizations, donors, and private investors. Last, by generating targeted policy recommendations and testing AWDO methodology in ADB's selected development members, AWDO 2020 will inform decision makers and public-private investments toward achieving water security in the region. AWDO 2020 incorporates several elements of novelty. The breadth and depth of the analysis have expanded with methodological advancements. The greater granularity of policy recommendations across finance and governance aspects, and the introduction of 3 case country studies: Thailand, India's state of Karnataka, and Timor-Leste. Ultimately, AWDO 2020 provides a stronger alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, as reflected in ADB's Strategy 2030. For all these reasons, AWDO is a key document for ADB's clients and partners in the region, and it was an honor and privilege for me to have worked with so many experts and colleagues across the region to produce this unique publication. And I'm glad that the key findings will be presented virtually today in Stockholm. I'm also taking this opportunity to commemorate our friend and colleague Mark Pascoe, who sadly passed away just a few weeks ago. He contributed enormously to AWDO and I had the honor to meet him in Manila back in 2019 when we were working together on this publication. He was actually supposed to moderate this session, but unfortunately it was not possible anymore. This is why this is pre-recorded. I'm now handing over to Elko van Beek, our ADB's consultant that has worked for many years with us to develop and refine the methodology and to ensure that the quality of this important report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sylvia. Indeed, I will present the AWDO methodology a little bit in more detail and setting the scene for the actual discussion, because what we are doing is we have quantified water security, but do we make impact? And that is where this session is about. So as Sylvia mentioned, we have had several AWDO publications. We have been cooperating, ADB and Asia Pacific Water Forum, for 15 years now. And that started in 2007 when this concept of water security was introduced and adopted. It was quantified in 2013. In 2016, the methodology was further improved and we started to track progress. And now recently, in 2020, we added governance, financing, methodology, and progress. So we have done what we are thinking a nice job in quantifying water security. But what is the impact of what we're doing? Are we producing more than just a coffee table book? And how can we reach the decision makers? Now, as Sylvia mentioned, it is a flagship publications of the ADB, with as primary objective to provide an overview and to provide a communication tool on water security, to inform and guide policy reforms and investments, and this progress, that is a strong point. With those 5 elements in AWDO, the key dimensions, rural households, water security, KD1, KD2, economic water security, then urban water security, environmental water security, and water-related disasters. But not only those 5 key dimensions, also the governance and what and finance elements, and what also Sylvia mentioned, the translation into action, the policy into action. That is the key of these sessions, in particular with case studies. So this quantification, how we have done it, we have done it by scoring those key dimensions with all kinds of variables and indicators on a scale of 1 and 10, at 1 till 20. And we added up those key dimensions to come to a national water security, which is a maximum of 5 times 20, 100. And in those scores, we applied an embedding to indicate the development stage. And then that what you see at the right, that the bending, if that the score is below 42, it is a nascent stage, and if you're more than 96, you're model, and so perfect. So and this nascent and engaged states are clear indication that water management is not sufficiently organized yet and needs strong improvement. Of course, also the other ones can be further improved. So this is the approach that we followed, and the result is something like this. And I'm not going to explain it in detail. You see to the left the 49 ADB members, countries. In the colors, you see each KD. The dark blue is KD1, etc. And adding up, and that is the total bar, is the overall national water security. And you will see that there is a major range. Afghanistan on the bottom, with only 38.8, and New Zealand at the top with 89.1. And striking, no country is model, and nobody is perfect. And it makes sense. There's one country that is in a nation stage. This hazardous state, and that is Afghanistan. Just as an example of the information you get out of it, you can present it in this way, where you see in the developed economies, you see that they are in the effective states. But you see also Afghanistan in the nation states. Just a way of presentation. Important is what also Sylvia mentioned, the development over time, because it has been done in 2013, 2016 and 2020, you see the development. You see a positive trend. The number of countries, AWDO members that are in the nation state, this very dangerous states, is going down from 4 to 1. You see also that countries have moved up from the nation engaged states to the capable and effective states. The number of countries that are in the effective states going up. So you see progress, clear progress if you look at the individual countries. China PSC moved from engaged to capable. India moved from nation to engaged. But even when we see progress, still many people are living in this engaged state of water security, this one, which, what I mentioned, is not good enough. Another way in which you can use this kind of information is if you compare it to the gross national income. Here you see to the left the water security of the country, and to the horizontal scale you see the gross national income, and indicated is all 49 countries in the Asia Pacific, and that indicates that if you're above that trend line, then you're doing well. And so answering the question, do you have to be rich to be water secure, or different way, or does water security leads to higher welfare? And you see that some countries do well compared to their gross national income, like Kyrgyz Republic, Philippines, Armenia, but also there are lagging performers. So this data, nice, but how can we make impact with this data? Our session in AWDO 2020, we tried hard. We recommended into policy recommendations. If you look at the document, you see all kinds of policy recommendations. We try to speak the language of decision makers, and that means more governance and more finance, not KD1 and KD2 only. We included the country case studies, the Thailand, India, PSC. Sylvia mentioned that already, and I will give an example of Thailand. Dissemination, interactive website, and we already had a clear impact, I think, of AWDO 2020 when the document had to be cleared by the countries. There were serious discussions with some countries on their scores, and that is exactly what the document aims to achieve. Discussion, communication, so efforts are being made. Given as an example, this big challenge, how to reach decision makers, how to link with economic development and investment decisions. The big example is I think is Thailand, and that's why I give this example. In the Thailand case that is described in AWDO 2020, they made the link between the national socio-economic development strategy with the master plan under that strategy, in which they also address the issue of water management, and the master plan on water resource management. And in that, they used AWDO as a tool to dialogue between the economic development that is being taken care of in the planning exercise by the Office of the National Economic and Social Development, and the people that work with the water management, and that is in this case the Office of National Water Management. And they've done that, including the special differentiation. That was a very valuable exercise, and I'm not going to explain this document, this slide in detail, but just showing how AWDO was used. To the right, you see this socioeconomic development plan at the highest level, the national strategy, in which you have elements that are related to water, like the water, energy, food nexus, and a sustainable green development. That is to the right side. And to the left side, you see the water management action plan, the master plan, in which you find water for drinking water, for protection, for water quality, for flood protection. And in the middle, you see how those socioeconomic development objectives are being translated into actions with AWDO elements, the KDs, the governments in making this translation. That's where I think we indeed, or Thailand actually, has made use of this quantification of water security to take action. So another example is Egypt. The National Water Resources Plan of Egypt 2013 had set targets for water security, and they used AWDO and the key dimensions to populate what they call the National Water Security Index. And they have stated clearly as a governmental objective that they are now in stage 2 engaged to effective in 2037. And they are following that progress, like we have done in AWDO. They do that also in Egypt. This is how we think can make a translation from just this data into actions. And that's what this session is about. We presented now AWDO, and that is also the start of the discussion, but there are other approaches. The Y scales, that relates more to domestic use, of United Nations exercise on and also the quantification of water security related to the SECs. And those two will be presented in the panel discussion. But there are other ones, the water tracker that is used in climate, the approach that is following to quantify SEC 5.1 on IWM. So what we hope is that we can learn from the lessons from AWDO, but also I guess that AWDO can learn from the lessons from others. So, and with this, I end my introduction and I give the word to Changwa for the panel discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I'm Changhua Wu, Vice Chair of Governing Council of Asia Pacific Water Forum. We are all in deep mourning for the sudden pass of our beloved late Chair of Governing Council of Asia Pacific Water Forum, Mark Pascoe, and we've lost a dear colleague, friend, and a role model. I'm honored to MC this session in Mark's absence. I would also like to express our greatest appreciation of all your steadfast support in this difficult time. Now, let me welcome you for joining this online pre-recorded panel discussion of AWDO water security data management, going beyond the collection to making impact. I would like to thank Dr. Sylvia Cardisia of ADB for her opening and the introductory remarks of AWDO, and also thank Professor Aiko van Beek for setting the scene for the discussion today. And now let me briefly introduce other panelists. They are Dr. Sarah Young, Associate Professor, Anthropology, Northwestern University, Dr. Lachlan Guthrie, Adjunct Industry Fellow, International Water Center Senior Consultant, Oricon, Dr. Charlotte McLaster, Senior Researcher, Water Resource UN, INWI, Dr. Stephen Kenway, Professor, Urban Water, the University of Queensland, and also Dr. Toshio Koika, Executive Director of ICHARM. And at the end of this discussion, I will also invite Dr. Thomas Panilla, Director, Environment, Natural Resources and Agriculture Division, East Asia Department of ADB, to help conclude our session with his closing remarks. As Elko said in his presentation, our session today is more like a session of sharing and learning. Although through the previous 4 products, has developed a set of methodology proven and impactful. But there are other approaches by different institutions and partners that could be comparable. So we will learn and examine some synergy today, and we'll also deep dive into a few reflective questions of AWDO around what are the lessons from AWDO, and also what can we learn from each other. So without further ado, I'm going to chew through my first question to Dr. Lachlan Guthrie, who was the main researcher of KD1 and also developer of the interactive website. So the AWDO user interface is meant to bring AWDO data more easily accessible to users. So my question to you, Lachlan, how far does this include users that might make investment decisions based on this kind of data? The floor is yours.
Thank you for that question. So firstly, I'd also like to acknowledge Mark. Mark was a dear friend of mine, and if it wasn't for his guidance and mentorship, I wouldn't be at this presentation. I probably wouldn't have been involved with AWDO at all. So really want to thank Mark for all his mentorship and guidance. And then I also want to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people, who are the traditional owners on which I'm recording this today. So now down to the question. So when we were developing the user profile, one of the things that we were really keen on doing is making, the user interface. We were really keen to make the document much more accessible, the data in it more accessible. So previously, AWDO was, quite over 100 pages, quite a lengthy thing, and difficult for someone to get into if they didn't have much knowledge of it previously. So what we wanted to do is make a more accessible, essentially first taste of AWDO. So when we were considering how it would be used, we had 4 user profiles in mind, which was across, national departments, CSOs, NGOs, internationally and locally, and then also in groups like the ADB. So ADB was a really key focus of what ADB users were a key focus of who we were targeting, and those use cases would obviously flow over into the World Bank and et cetera, et cetera. So we created a series of different pages, each with different visuals targeted to those different user groups. And overall, it can provide some really good high-level guidance on where you can focus your priorities throughout the Asia Pacific. So for example, comparisons between countries, comparisons inside of countries between sectors. Yeah, that quite high level thought, but all of this really needs, it should be thought of as the first stage of planning, the first stage in that planning cycle, which then needs to be ground truthed. It needs people on the ground to actually develop the recommendations and the findings into implementable projects, which would then lead to decision investment. So as well as the user interface, there was a few other things that we created at a similar time, or myself and Elko, who's just given the opening address. So those being the data management system, and so that's downloadable from the user interface, and that's essentially, that includes every single piece of data that was called upon in AWDO. It does require a bit more understanding of how AWDO works, but you can really, if you're looking at your certain country or a certain region and you're wondering, oh, how did that number come about? The data management system really gives you that ability to go in and see where the problem is, see what the problem area is there. And then obviously, as I said before, it does need to be ground truth. It needs to be, before building into infrastructure decisions, you need that on ground experience. And then there's also the methodology report, which Elko produced recently, and that again just gives you a really good understanding of how the data was pulled together into the concise into the AWDO report and the AWDO numbers. So yeah, in summary, the decision making, it does take into account quite a few different users and how they might work with it, but it we should stress that it's that first prioritization. It's incredibly good at being that first prioritization, but it's not the end of the planning pathway as it shouldn't be.
Okay, thank you. So now, based on that, so Sarah, and my question to you probably will start with the introduction of the WISE scales. As I mentioned early on, so probably WISE scales is one of the comparable approach that also could look into and also benefiting from it. And so I would like to invite you to do an introduction of that and tell us how it works. Thank you.
Thanks for that question. So the WISE scales are a new-ish, straightforward, accurate, and open access tool for bringing a human perspective to data that's useful for policymakers. So in the course of my research, I wanted to quantify women's experiences with water insecurity. And I went to the literature to see what was on offer for indicators, and I found that there are lots of ways of measuring physical availability. JMP does a great job of measuring infrastructure. Of course, there are lots of ways of measuring water safety, but what I was looking for was something holistic to measure how people access water, how they use water, not just for drinking, but all domestic needs, and if that was reliable across time. This was on my mind because food insecurity experiences are the basis for SDG 2.1. And when we measure experiences with access, use, and reliability of food to track our progress towards leaving no one behind in terms of hunger. So if you don't find the tool you need, you make it. And I will spare you many of the details, but a large group of us created the water insecurity experiences scales, and we did it in a lot of sites around the world, and we used lots of blood and sweat and tears and statistics to do so. And with these 12 items, they take just 3 minutes to administer. We can see more precisely who is being left behind or not. So these are nationally representative data from Egypt, but we have such data from at least 40 countries. And you can see along the left, the 12 items that comprise the scale. You can see, for example, that 39% of Egyptians felt angry about their water situation in the last year. Taking those data together, we see that a quarter of Egyptians are water insecure, and this paints a much different picture than what we know based on JMP drinking water access ladder data, which is that less than 1% of Egyptians have less than basic drinking water access. So what this tells us is that infrastructure is necessary, but not sufficient for water security. What these data also tell us is with more granularity, who is experiencing water insecurity. So we can see that women are experiencing water insecurity more than men, and that urban and rural settings alike are both experiencing significant problems with life-damaging problems with water. So the WISE scales have been taken up by a lot of organizations in a number of countries. The places that are green are where we have nationally representative data. You can see that we have a growing number of sites from Asia, but we have some work to do there. Unfortunately, data will be rolling in more and more as, for example, Feed the Future is mandating it in their midline evaluations. The governments are taking it up. So just, for example, the government of Mexico just finished implementing the WISE scales in their National Health and Nutrition Survey. UNICEF has implemented it in a mixed survey in Mongolia. And I'm smiling very broadly here because Minister Luhut of Indonesia expressed a lot of interest in understanding the experiences of water insecurity in Indonesia. And I think that uptake has been as big as it has because we can use these scales across multiple levels. So we can use them at the country level or the city level or the neighborhood level to understand prevalence, and not just prevalence sort of in a ball of wax, but who is it? Older people, younger people, which gender or religion. We can also use it to understand the impacts of programs and shocks. So we don't have to count boreholes to see what kind of impact there has been. We can see how our people's lives are changed. And then of course, because the measurement is at high resolution, at the household level, and we can measure it also at the individual level, we can track how water insecurity directly shapes health and well-being. And as such, the data that it generates has been really useful for making decisions about investment. It's been useful for advocating for resources, and of course it influences policymaking. So with that, I'll just say my grand evil plans are for us to do better than measure water insecurity at the national level in just these 48 countries, but to paint this map green. I think we need nationally representative data for all 170 countries in the world, and that data should be available for robust policymaking. It should inform these portals that we have for data. And it should also empower people to take that data, to take this tool and to drill down within their own communities to understand who exactly is being left behind. I'll just point you to this website, hwise.org, where you can find a lot more information. Thank you.
Thank you. I learned a lot. Thank you, Sarah. I believe the colleagues actually working for AWDO have, on this program have already started to sort of taking, really trying to understand more and to figure out the linkage there. And of course, for the next round of conversation, I would love to get your sort of insightful thinking about, how to sort of, I wouldn't say merge, but somehow build more synergy between your scale and also the AWDO there as well. So thank you. During Sarah's presentation, I can hear there is a natural sort of linkage there already with the Charlotte's work with the UNU INWE, from the database perspective. Particularly, Sarah mentioned that this is sort of the SDG linkage. And so next, I would like to invite Charlotte to give us the introduction of the UNU INWE work, and particular around the SDG database. Charlotte, please. Charlotte, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry, I have a little bit of a delay. Can you just confirm you're seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. So yeah, I see a lot of commonalities and a lot of kind of big differences too. So I'll just jump right in. For those of you who don't know about the UNU system, UNU INWE is one of the 13 UN research institutes, and we are the Institute for Water, Environment and Health, and we focus entirely on water for development in the global south. So INWE is the UN water think tank and has been working on water security for the last 2 decades. Like, for example, there's this all-encompassing definition of water security, like the UN definition of water security, and that was developed in this long process led by UNU. So that's just to set the scene a little bit. So what are we doing? We've been continuing with this kind of background water security work, and this year in World Water Day, we released the first, our preliminary assessment of water security in Africa. And it actually is, I would say, I don't want to say modeled, but heavily relies on the model that AWDO used. Rather than having the complex key dimensions, it's kind of more high level, and it has 10 components of water security. So try to be more easily understandable by non-specialists, aiming more at decision makers and policy makers. And we try to use, let's say, metrics that are easily identifiable in public data sets, ideally whether the data sets compiled by the countries. And we don't have the complex key dimensions. Like I said, we have the 10 components scored out of 10 with a national water index out of 100. And we try to avoid complex sub-indicators because many of the typical quantitative indicators are in fact like aggregated from many other indicators themselves. And so, as you can see in the next slide, many of the indicators that we're using are common to the AWDO KDs, the key dimensions, and also to the SDGs. So I kind of skipped over it, but INWE has sort of a mandate within the UNU to support SDG 6, obviously the water SDG. And we have other tools, including a policy support system. We're not an indicator custodian, such as, impedes or FAO, but we support countries in making progress towards achieving the SDG indicators or the targets of those indicators. So like it makes sense to try and lean on the SDG indicators. And in fact, countries are already invested in achieving these indicators. But when we go down to the looking at actual data level, specifically in Africa, less so in Asia, but particularly in Africa, it's very hard for countries to achieve even, recording these indicators, as you'll see from the African example. So the first three components rely heavily on GMP. In fact, they are the GMP indicators, but for Africa, it's not possible to have a good coverage for safely managed drinking water, safely managed sanitation. We have to go back a step to at least basic. And in fact, some countries don't, comply with the recording of at least basic. So we have to adjust, according to the data that's available. Similarly, for burden of disease, there's very little data from Africa, so we have to use other data sets as proxies. Also, I'm going to get to it, but we're trying to make impact, right? What is the point in doing this if we're not going to actually make an impact in terms of helping countries to make progress? We go in terms of getting impact. Of course, we compiled the data, we wrote the report, we published it, we promoted it, we went directly to the national agencies that we work with in any case in helping them within the SDG 6. And we have a lot of feedback from them, and we're trying to work with them to incorporate the feedback as we move forward. But okay, so like taking something simple like component number 4, water availability, there's a lot of misunderstanding of what, as a hydrologist, I totally accept as the FAO statistic on total renewable water resources. This data is collected by countries, it's compiled by FAO, but when you present that as an indicator of water security to a national policymakers, you get a lot of pushback because they don't feel that it's representative of one of their components of water resources because they don't understand what is included within that essential water balance. So there's a lot still, actually not a lot, a huge amount of capacity building is required in order to make this information accessible and usable to decision makers, right? And I really like the AWDO interface that Lachlan's been presenting because this goes a long way to doing that. But we also have to think about the data that's behind those indicators. So really, what are we doing as we move forward? Well, first of all, I'll just do a quick overview of what our conclusions were from Africa. So it's a little bit different to AWDO 2020. It's probably more like the earlier versions of AWDO 2020. We also have a kind of a service ladder of scoring as AWDO does. It's a little bit different in the terms that we use and the boundaries, because we want to distinguish between AWDO and the assessment that we're completing, because we're now repeating this at a global level. So we don't want to, contradict what's in AWDO. But it's using the same model. You can see it just looks like AWDO, right? But it's for Africa. 17 out of the 54 countries in Africa basically are still at the lowest measured level. 24 have made it into the next level, so slightly water secure. 13 made it into the modest level, but none have reached an effective or model level. So it's a little bit, really struggling, at least in terms of a quantitative assessment. Interesting what Sarah was saying, because Egypt comes out the highest based on these indicators. They came out really well. And I'm sure they're happy about that. And I know that they are really trying and pushing towards achieving their targets, but maybe the GMP data on water and sanitation are not representative and other things. And I have to say, like, this is a very quantitative, technical kind of assessment. It doesn't really take into account social factors. We do have, if I skip back, water governance, but this is purely based on 6.51, which is the degree of integrated water resource implementation. And that is what we're using really as a proxy for governance. That doesn't really mean governance is what we're using as a proxy for governance. It's an SDG target, and therefore it should be acceptable to the countries. So this is very challenging in Africa. Let me just say, like, most of my career I spent actually in Asia, so I'm familiar with the Asia data sets. Very different situation in Africa. It's quite hard to get the data, and you know, we did had a lot of really interesting and useful feedback from the countries, and they want to be involved in it moving forward. They want to shape the indicators, and they would like to, this is a direct quote from Liberia, set the standard for the tool. So they do want to do it, but the capacity gap is quite huge right now. So how to meet that capacity gap? So moving forward, we are trying to maintain this kind of simple high-level approach with 10 components. I'm working on improving some of the metrics. Some of them don't make sense, like the dependency ratio doesn't make sense for small island developing states. Islands don't depend on other countries for their water source. So, you know, some things need to be adjusted as we move forward. And in my personal opinion, like, data availability is a component of water security, like any would be the same for energy security. If you're not measuring it, you know, the chances are that you don't have it to measure. And we're really working to, you know, how can we have a process that usefully incorporates country and policy active feedback? Yeah, and that's it. And I'm happy to have discussion about this. And, you know, of course, we'd love to have an AWDO for all of the countries in the global south. But what I've learned from so far doing this for Asia and Africa and Latin America is that this is going to be very challenging. Like, you would think, for example, that World Health Organization, the JMP data would have full coverage. No, it does not. Like, you will not find safely managed drinking water for Latin America, not even for the Caribbean, certainly not for Central America. So we have to make some compromises, and this is why we went for this simple 10 indicator approach, but even that itself is very challenging. But I look forward to, like, future discussion on how we can work on this together and overcome some of these challenges.
Thank you, Charlotte. And I fully understand to see how challenging it has been. We often say if it's a long march, at least the first step is already taken. So I'm delighted to see AWDO methodology framework, even the database actually have been referenced, sort of valuable for your work, you know, in other parts of the South as well. So thank you. Now I'm going to ask Dr. Stephen Canwy and some question around the KD3. And so you and your team have been leading the, you know, KD3, which is about urban water management. And so I would like to figure out, actually use this opportunity to ask you a specific question around, say, you know, how do you engage decision makers in urban context, and how you have been sort of the work had been used, you know, by urban decision makers actually for their specific actions on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I too would like to acknowledge Mark Pascoe for his fantastic leadership in the Asian Water Development Outlook. He's been involved since the very first one was released in 2007. As Ilko showed, the AWDO's been running for nearly 15 years now. It's had 4 iterations, looking for a 5th iteration. His wonderful leadership and impact. And I wanted to also clarify my view that AWDO is one of the world's leading quantitative water security assessment frameworks. A lot of what we'll suggest and talking about today, how can it be done better? I think part of Mark's legacy and ADB and its supporters' legacy is a very open and continual improvement mindset, which I think we've seen it lift and lift and lift. And to have a quantitative analysis of multiple dimensions of security, over a 16-year time frame is unheralded. And I was one of my conclusions for a latter session was about it would be great to see AWDO being used further. And so I was delighted to see Charlotte's presentation using many elements, not entirely, but many elements of the AWDO framework, including its quantitative framework for Africa. That's absolutely wonderful to see, Charlotte. And similar, Sarah, your WISE and water insecurity assessment covers a different issue in a sort of across many continents, also in a semi-quantitative way. And I think the evolution of how we understand security and its multi-dimensional impacts on communities, on the environment, on industry, on economies, is only going to get more important in future as we get impacted by climate change. So moving back to the question, how does AWDO influence urban decision-making? Well, I guess what AWDO, or the Asian Water Development Outlook, quantifies is how strong is urban water security, key dimension 3 now, and how strong has it been in the past? Because it relies on data, and particularly joint monitoring program data, AWDO has traditionally been backward looking. It looks at, do we have households connected to water supply? Do we have wastewater connected to sewage infrastructure? Do we have sewage treatment? So it's a little bit of a backward looking framework because it has to look where we can see data. I'll talk a little bit more down the track about how we can make it more looking into the future, but looking backwards is a very good start to see, well, how well is it being managed? And I guess at a national scale, shining the light on how quantitative, how well we see security currently being managed is a very strong indicator for future investment. So I think just promoting every 3 to 4 years, as AWDO does, which countries are managing security and which ones are improving security as quickly as possible. And it's a very slow moving thing to shift the full water supply infrastructure and sewage infrastructure and flooding infrastructure of a country or a city. So it's a slow moving thing, but I think nonetheless, AWDO provides a good framework for supporting that investment. And so that's at national scale. I think where we see the strongest impact, particularly into the urban space, are examples like slide 13 of Ilko's introduction, the Thai example, where they have done a province level security assessment. So for about 50 sub areas of Thailand, which include many urban areas, they can now see how those security ratings perform within the country. One of the things we trialed in a sub-report in AWDO 2020 was to also look at city scale. So rather than just looking at an amalgamation of all cities, so across a massive country like China or even Australia or India, to then unpick every city greater than 1 million people and see how those levels of security perform, because water security is often a very local issue. It depends on the climate, it depends on future climate, it depends on the infrastructure and pricing. And so to downscale would also have a massive implication for data. And one of the challenges we saw, the joint monitoring program, which is a phenomenal data set at national scale, to unpack that consistently across multiple countries would be a phenomenal challenge. So we're able to access some data for that, but it's almost like either the level of resolution of UN data sets, like the joint monitoring program, would need to evolve. So beyond national level to either province or even city scale, or we need an organic process, a little bit like's happened in Thailand and also India or Karnataka state, and I think a little bit in other countries like East Timor and Indonesia and even China, where they're doing sub-national security analysis. So I think AWDO gives a really fantastic framework for that. I think it at a national level, it can influence security, but because water is heavy, it's often determined by provincial government or local government. We do need to downscale it to have an even stronger impact on urban water security. So I'll finish my comment there, Chang Wao, but very happy to expand on that if you'd like.
Yeah, and for next round, I'm going to finish this round first, actually. So, okay, I definitely have more questions actually to you, particularly around the water at the subnational level there. So next, I'm going to ask Dr. Toshio Koika from iChime. You've been leading KD5, which is about disasters, right? And Steve just mentioned, actually, if you look at the past of the experience, particularly from urban, of course, and other dimensions there as well, we're more like a backward looking, right? We collected data to measure, and then with the number or color scheme, whatever, right? And but somehow for climate change, natural, you know, extreme weather events, yes, you have to look backward, but more and more so you have to look into forward, you know, future, forward looking there as well, because we're living in it and we sort of know, climate change is intensifying. There are going to be more and more natural disasters that we have to handle, particularly around, you know, water related. So in that bigger context, my question to you, say, okay, particularly from KD5 perspective, how have you been reaching out to decision makers in our region, and how the work you've been leading has been impactful, actually, from that perspective? Thank you.
Thank you, Chanpa. As you introduced the ICHAM, the International Center for Water Hazard Risk Management, it focused on water-related disaster, but the water-related disaster is closely related to other water security or other sustainable development goals, including food, energy, poverty, health, and education. So, of course, urban is a very, very important, and natural environment also. So that's why we have a full strategy to discuss with policymakers of each country and also the practitioners. The one is as I mentioned, our target is we should cover the wide range of the target. So that's why we establish a platform on water resilience and disasters in each country by inviting the related department, ministry, authorities, the director general level chairmanship, or in some country, the undersecretary level chairmanship platform by inviting the many related department authorities. For example, in Indonesia, 5 ministries, public works, their disaster management and hydrometeorology and agriculture and environment. The 5 ministries work together on the platform. And in case of the Philippines, more than 25 departmental authorities and also the University of the Philippines, the 3 schools join, and then the Undersecretary of the DPWH and Undersecretary of the DOST, Department of Science and Technology, co-chair that platform. So in that framework, the second strategy, we are the research institute, so that's why we provide the integrated scientific knowledge, including climate change, and not only the disaster, but the disaster affect the food security or energy security. So such kind of the related matter should be integrated. We usually say this is convergence, the integrated knowledge by using the data integration analysis system. Our government has been developed this kind of the very huge data integration system. The capacity is more than the 10 petabyte class, more than 100 petabyte class. So such kind of the data integration system we use, and subsystem is now being introduced into each country. So they operate by themselves. So such kind of convenience, the integrated knowledge creation, that is the second approach. The third approach, our ICHAM has a master course and then the PhD course in collaboration with the university, and supported by JICA. So through this educational function, we try to grow the a kind of the facilitator. Facilitator is not the master of ceremony who can work together with local community or central government, of course. So the such kind of the expert who can support to the decision making. So such kind of the educational component, facilitator, fostering the facilitator is one of the key strategy. And then we have a platform, convenience, and facilitator. And the fourth strategy is end-to-end approach, from the cutting edge science to the actual the local action. So this kind of the very integrated the end-to-end approach we are now promoting in each country. This is our strategy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Koika. Can I just ask you a follow-up question? And so now we started to look into AWDO 25, right? The fifth one. So based on the work you've been doing and also you've been living in the reality in terms of to become more impactful. So looking into next AWDO, what are some sort of key aspects do you think that needed to be you needed to get more attention to, of policymakers or decision makers in order to do a much better job, not only on KD5 itself in terms of the data, but also, data policy, but also on the impact side there as well. This is my follow-up question to you, Dr. Koika. Thank you.
I think the AWDO 2022, I saw so many times that I saw the climate change so many times, but I cannot find any quantitative, but even the qualitative assessment due to the climate change in future. So yeah, we need to consider the climate change risk, and we need to improve the climate resilience. A lot of the sentence, but no practical information is included in the current out. That is my feeling. The policy maker, as you know, at the United Nations level and all over the world, policy makers are much interested in the climate change. What they should do now. So I think by using currently available data set, and we should add the climate change impact on the output. That is my concern. Of course, globally we have a very reliant answer from the IPCC assessment report 6. But locally or regionally, we still have uncertainty. So that's why we need to solve that uncertainty. We have already developed such kind of methodology. So we try to apply and then share such an impact with many countries. That is my point. Thank you.
Sure. Can I just give you a suggestion? So I do agree with you. The real life challenge, climate is so intensifying, resilience becomes so critical. Of course, water is at the core of the resilience there. Chinese government, and mid of June, released the first ever, probably the first, if not the only one, but very few actually, even globally, something called the China Climate Adaptation Resilience Strategy 2035. It's literally sort of a midterm sort of development plan around resilience, climate resilience. Interesting enough, in it, all the things actually, so what to do is pretty much laid out already. But there's one particular issue in the Chinese policy context that called 4 things defined by water. It's about land use, about city, about land use, about people's settlement, as well as the economic activities. So planners actually in China from now on they have to, when they do those decisions, that has to be, built upon water security, right? In the bigger context of resilience there as well. My suggestion is that the challenge though, so everything is right there on the table, on paper, but how do they deliver that? Which is going to require, really huge number the data, right? You need the data supports, evidence supports there. So that probably has created an opportunity to address your challenge you mentioned actually. That's a good starting point already. Political will is there, plan is there. It's a strategic it's about a climate resilient society by 2035 with a lots of details there. Water is at the core of it. So I have a suggestion particular to you. I think if you have not started working with your partners in China, I think you should. Actually, this is a great opportunity to address the issues actually you mentioned. So that's my suggestion.
Yes, so thank you very much, Emperor. I'm also the chair of the River Council of Japan, and then change the river management, the policy through the collaboration with ministry. And the 9 Act was amended. And the new policy is now ongoing. So in such way, several countries, including China, they can lead this action by themselves. Then adaptation or some climate resilience action should be taken by the national government leadership.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We need to support such activity by sharing the information.
Yeah. I mean, not only sharing, I think also, so maybe we're gathering lots of data, but what kind of data? We need to really make sure we gather the right kind of data, whatever, at the granularity.
That's why I introduced the data integration and the end-to-end approach and the facilitators function. These are the very, very important to support the government.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to move on. I'm moving backward now. So now back to Stephen, actually. On one side, as you said, I'm very intrigued by the sub-national level. You mentioned that this is not only overarching high-level national, but also provincial and city level. Just based on my knowledge experience in China, we have statistical system, right? The urban water management system, lots of dimensions or indicators of data are pretty much in the national statistical a system there, right? So I believe many other countries similar there as well. So around the urban water management, around this work, this KD3, and also looking into 2025, how do you see maybe converging more and more, because you don't want to create a totally separate set of data, right? You need to gather data from the subnational, national, subnational level, but also make sure whatever intellectually, product output generated from AWDO shall be valuable, back to support, meaningful to those decision makers at the urban level there as well. So how do you see that process going, down to the looking into AWDO 2025 there? Thank you.
Fantastic question. I think as we discuss the future of AWDO, it's important to discuss how do we improve actual security and how do we improve the assessment of security, and the data is critical to both of them. Maybe if I briefly comment on actual security to begin with, and then the assessment of security. I think what we learned from AWDO 2020 is that the Pacific island nations are in particularly urgent need of security consideration. That's even just looking backward at infrastructure. When you look forward at climate change and sea level rise, it's an absolutely dire situation that needs to be addressed urgently. South Asia in particular is also, while there's 2 million people at high risk in the Asia Pacific, there's something like 800 million in the nascent category, or the second lowest category in South Asia. And so I think to do further work to improve security there, we need to overlay future climate. So what areas are expected to have drying or more volatile climate in future, to find a subset of that 800 million to improve security for. And I think that's where the subnational, the question that you ask, fits in here really well. It gives a much higher resolution on how to target improve security. One of the most powerful things that we saw both within ADB and also within the Thai and I think Karnataka, India case studies was when actual investment was overlaid with current security. Can you see a good correlation between investment flowing to areas of low security or not? And I guess that's how we follow the joint the Sustainable Development Goals and make sure that no one is left behind. I think the core of your question is, how do we balance Asia-wide security quantification and benchmarking with subnational, where we know, or city scale, where we know critical investment is needed? And I think there's a very strong need for the global benchmarking, because that drives a sort of national scale improvement, and there's a need for bottom up. But at the Asia-wide scale, the data flows to deal with that are going to be very inconsistent. I think it's almost going to be impossible to do that at Asia-wide or global scale. So there is a need to think about how those two scales do interconnect. And I don't have a clear answer for that. We do know that the framework that has been used for AWDO has been wonderful for about 12 years, but is also in need of refreshment. So when it was first conceptualized, risk was this independent and disaster was this independent thing. But I think risk is a part of urban water security. It's a part of rural water security. It's a part of environmental water security, as are disasters. And so I think risk needs to migrate inside all of those and inform all of those in a much stronger way. We also see a really strong need to use the pressure state response framework, so that we have what is our current security, what are our pressures on security, whether it's climate change or population growth. The negative pressures, and positive pressures would be investment or governance. And so what can we project future water security or insecurity will be? Because I think we have to shift the outlook from looking backwards to looking forwards. And I think it's only using the sort of data that Dr. Koiko and other much higher resolution data sets that are available now, and much more sophisticated models of future climate that we can use much more significantly to do that. So I think the framework is part of the answer, Changhua, that we need a framework that thinks not only clearly about the key dimensions and future risk, but also how does that framework apply at different scales. And I think we need to strengthen how we quantify security. And I think one of the great innovations of AWDO 2020 was adopting a definition that says security really needs local stakeholders engaged in defining what that security means for them. How do they want their water to provide for their food, their livability, their energy futures, because water is a common denominator for all of those things in a sustainable future world. And while AWDO 2020 could start to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals as specific targets, like in KD3, target 6.2, safely managed, we could say that is the target. And so we could quantitatively track countries moving towards that in their urban water security. We need that, but we also need input from local communities as to how they define security. So I think AWDO 2025 or into the future, ideally, just thinking in an idealistic way, needs to work out how to embrace bottom-up data from either at city level, at individual city, mapping out its security at a sub-city level, right through to something that could be used globally to benchmark how cities progressively adapting to the challenges that climate change will inevitably have for them. And a lot of that impact will be via water.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really very constructive there as well. Charlotte, so originally I was planning to ask you about the comparability or synergy of your SDG database and also but I learned from your introduction already, there's already sort of closely linked, connected with each other. So I probably will throw you another question, particularly, let's say, that focusing on Africa, right? And so the SDG database, whatever you have now, it's also on one side definitely urgently needed to be improved. But in the meantime, if you look at the climate change we're talking about here, right? And climate change is pretty much about water security there, besides all the other challenges, the socioeconomic challenges there as well. So really looking into why we, from the region, we are all looking into AWDO 25, trying to put, to do a much better job. But then for you, in the global South, particularly in Africa, what do you see, maybe one or two major priorities that's from your work and from the SDG database perspective that need to happen to improve in order to better support actually the water security for instance, just in Africa? Thank you.
I think it's hard to have one or two priorities. There are actually, if we just take an
everything,
perspective, many, everything. I mean, okay.
I mean, like, if you narrowly pin down to SDG 6, I mean, like, what is life?
Yes,
it's
of course.
Everything. Yeah, if just pin down, yeah.
Yeah, only in SDG 6. That's so. I mean, okay.
Narrow down
if I just look at the if I just take it from the quantitative perspective, right? I kind of put the water and sanitation, and even actually, sanitation related burden of disease to one side, because I think that, nobody can really do a better job of improving on at least the quantification of that than WHO and UNICEF, with input from NGOs like WaterAid, who we work closely with. I mean, yes, it's not perfect as reflected in Sarah's assessment in Egypt, but okay, they are really the specialists in that. So if I look more to the water resource side, in terms of assessment, I mean, groundwater has always been a huge challenge, like understanding the quantity of groundwater, the accessibility of groundwater, and the many different dimensions to that. Okay, so like I worked and lived in the Nile Basin in Ethiopia for several years, and obviously Ethiopia has and the Horn of Africa generally has a huge groundwater resource, but very little access to that resource. So just to say, okay, you're not including our groundwater resource in this water security assessment. Yeah, but how do we do that? Like when I worked for IMI, I had to do an assessment of groundwater resource in Ethiopia and in the Upper Nile Basin. There's no data, right? Like if you can't quantify it, then how can you say that, okay, we have all this groundwater, we know it's there, let alone the fact that, there might only be 3 functioning drilling rigs in the country and no engineers to operate or maintain them. So yes, you have a groundwater resource that you could tap in to improve your water security, but you don't have any access to that groundwater. So how to quantify that, and how to how to use that to strengthen the country's water resource, which in the end is what we're trying to do. We're only quantifying it so that we can change policy, so that we can make action, so that we can make communities more water secure, right? The same thing goes for, I've been getting a lot of comments back about, okay, our assessment with the 10 components doesn't reflect climate change, as you mentioned there. Like, we know it's happening, right? And as hydrologists or water resource specialists, we know like a lot of the physical impacts. What does that really mean? But how can we, I mean, like Stephen mentioned, there are many excellent model data sets, but which one do we select if we want to use that as an indicator? And even so we are using quite simplistic indicators like interannual variability. Well, interannual variability as expressed within FA or Aquastat is almost like a constant, right? It's an average over a 10 or 20 year or 30-year period. And as climate is changing, then that does not necessarily reflect the last 5 to 10 years. So that's like why just groundwater and changing climate. Yeah, just groundwater and interannual variability are 2 huge priorities. And then I never mentioned water quality and water treatment. Like that is just if we just only look at Africa, that is a huge black hole, right? There is water, there is some water treatment, there is some, whether we're talking about domestic or industrial, but there's very little information on that. And it will only become a bigger and bigger issue. So in terms of contamination of the freshwater resource and in terms of surface water contamination, as industry grows in, for example, Ethiopia again, a huge burgeoning industrial development, many very large Chinese investment in the country. Manufacturing is so, but you know, there is very little treatment of water of contaminated effluent. Certainly no data on it. So how do we express that? Like that is a huge water quality and
can I just
I've given you 3.
You know, it could be long, but I think there's one particular point I want to drive here is that on one side, of course, the region, generally the South, is lacking the capability. We don't have data, even the availability challenges there. And we're mostly talking about looking backward, past or now, whatever. But now in the bigger context, climate change actually impacting, intensifying now, we have to look into the future, what's coming up, because whatever we're doing now or in the past is not adequate anymore. We wouldn't be able to really get to the water security we are aiming for because of, you know, the intensifying climate change there. So from data perspective, that's a real life challenge. I think not only for Africa, but for us actually, for Asia as well. So that's the point I think probably is getting sort of highlighted more and more. So that's probably a point I want to drive there as well. So thank you for now. And so let me move back to Sarah. And while the conversation going, and it's fascinating to see this human, you know, perspective, you know, of water security, of policy making around water security. There's one angle I haven't heard much is about health, right? You talk about women, it's fascinating. I think the gender issue, even for us in Asia, from ADB's perspective, that particular indicator has not been very well captured, at least not in AWDO in Asia at this moment. I think that's a great sort of linkage connection there. But also there's a health issue there, right, as well. And so I'm just more looking into this synergy between AWDO and your scales, right? And also looking into the future, the synergy while we're doing the AWDO, you know, AWDO 2025. Plus, I haven't heard much about the health element there. So can you just share a little bit of sort of thoughts of yours on that? And because this is going to be a very important sort of element to impact decision making, right, in different regions. Thank you.
Well, I teach a whole class about water and health, so I recommend you go to Chicago, and I'll talk with you.
I can take it online. I would be happy to take it.
But to Charlotte's point about, like, we need to understand infrastructure. We need to understand the water resources. We need to understand water quality. I mean, I am not arguing at all those are necessary, but they're not sufficient to understand health and well-being. So like JMP does great stuff, but knowing how many cubic meters per capita there are in Kenya doesn't tell me about this woman in particular who I'm studying, or, you know, who we want to know how her HIV viral load is being affected by water security, or how her decision to exclusively breastfeed or not is shaped by dehydration or fetching water. Which is why we need these global and national measurements, but we need also information at the individual level so we can see how individual water insecurity experiences shape school attendance or shape viral load. And that's kind of the special sauce that these scales add. And they're proving to be wildly predictive of all kinds of health outcomes. I mean, we have a collaboration right now with FAO where we measured both water insecurity and food insecurity in the same 50,000 individuals. And we now see, just like these data are under review right now, that if you are water insecure, you have roughly 3 times more likely, or are more likely to be food insecure. And it's well established that food insecurity is associated with causes depression, causes stress, causes A to Z. So it's if we're not measuring individual water insecurity, we can't predict health outcomes. But now that we can, it's opening up this whole new world of understanding predictors of health. And I'm really glad you asked that. And what's especially appealing is that we can see how the same water insecurity experience varies by gender. So we have another study where we measured water insecurity amongst men and women. And we see that they're roughly experiencing the same amount of water insecurity. But women who are water insecure are much more likely to be depressed than men who experience water insecurity. So even when we're seeing the same exposure, the consequences can be different by gender. So that's one slice of the health piece, but there's much more.
Very, very valuable, very useful. Thank you. And so Lachlan, back the question to you. So early on when I asked you a question about, you know, the AWDO data, particularly of course the accessibility of the AWDO database to investment community, right? You did give a sort of overarching reflection there, but I want to drive a little bit further. Rather than asking you why accessibility transparency is so important, we all know it's important, of course. We don't have to further elaborate that within this group. But I do want to drive down further, you know, and how, you know, investment, I deal with investors a lot over my professional life. Even water related, you know, the risk factors are very important for investors actually to consider when they assessment or evaluate, you know, the risk and returns of their investment, or whether they're going to make the investment or not. So water security data, and particularly I think AWDO's contribution in that perspective becomes more and more actually you know, important or recognized there as well. I just out of curiosity, besides this, you mentioned the high level sort of you know, sort of data over picture there. But in order for investors to really make their decision, getting closer to the impact, I think probably this is one of the dimensions we could look into when we get down to look into AWDO 25. So that's one question. The second question, actually, we've been talking throughout the conversation, AWDOs who are targeted audience, we're talking about the decision making, right? But the more interactive interface of the data should be open to go beyond that, right? And I think the last time we were online with the AWF 2022, we talked about sort of scientific research community. I think even maybe we can go beyond that because we do need to make sure, you know, maybe general public, you know, citizen science, and there's a sort of general, so, you know, general public, they might be, you know, interested in that. So it's a sort of two questions, and but somehow just I know your center has been also creating different user interfaces there. So you could just share maybe a little bit. So are you expanding, you know, the accessibility to broader audience there as well? So two sort of questions, you can make them linked or not. Thank you.
Yeah, so I will make them linked if that's okay. So one of the really key theories that I push in decision making is that the principles that your really high level assessment is based on should be the exact same principles that your lower levels assessments are based on. So thinking, you know, right through to making subnational assessments. So for me, the key about AWDO, so the assessment that Steve and I and the others have helped created, that's what we took the framework and we applied it as best we could with the data that was available at the national scale. But and the thing that really excites me about assessments like Charlotte's, like what's done in Thailand, Karnataka, and so on, is that they've taken the principles and the framework and they've reinterpreted and assimilated it into a way that makes sense in that environment. And so I think that by doing that and by making AWDO's principles and frameworks much more accessible, you create ownership. So you allow people to do their own assessments and own their own assessments at those lower levels. So for me, like the Thailand example, which Elko talked about earlier, it's so exciting because it's taking AWDO and it's making it applicable to Thailand, and it's owned by Thailand, and it's now being able to be used to drive water security in Thailand. Same for Egypt as well. So I think it's that ownership that's so important when we're trying to influence decision makers, making them own the assessment. So it's not some expert who's sitting in an air-conditioned office in Brisbane. It's actually an assessment that's owned by the company and is trusted. So the area where the user interfaces and the data accessibility and transparency come into it is by making it more accessible and more transparent, is it enables someone to then look at the data themselves and make their own story. So, you know, we've got our own interpretations of the data, and it's that interpretation of the data that is so important. I've got my own interpretation of the data, but by handing the data over to you, allowing you to make your own assessment, you're no longer needing to trust me, because, you know, the majority of the decision makers have no idea who I am. They don't trust me at all. They don't know me. But if I say, here's the data, this is what I use to make that assessment, hopefully they come up with the same answer. But if they don't, that's still okay, because it's their answer, and it's and they have ownership, and they can then drive that investment. Yeah, so I think I've tried to answer both there, but
yeah.
the question, yeah, the ownership is the real important element.
You did a great job. Thank you very much. I know time is running short, but I just now I'm sort of turning a little bit of fun actually for a few minutes, just within the panelists. Among you, between you, do you have any questions actually you want to direct to your colleagues? You have a few minutes to do so. Anyone? Any burning questions that I haven't asked that you want to seek answers?
Well, I mean, I have a question as someone
Sure.
who's relatively less familiar with the AWDO report. I mean, do you see utility in bringing the human voice to your understandings of water security in Asia?
Good question.
I definitely do. So in my mind, the purpose of household water security is delivering a service, and I think the WISE scales really enable us to understand, at least in a semi-quantitative way, what that service is actually delivering. We know from behaviour change that it's not just about infrastructure that leads to a good service. It needs to be infrastructure, cultural expectations, education, all these raft of things. And I think the WISE scales really do a good job at assessing the sort of end result of that service.
Cool, thank you.
If I could add to that, I think it's the same applies in the urban space, but it also applies across all of AWDO in determining what the cities or nations want to achieve with their water into the future. That trade-off between water for cities, water for food, water for energy, it will only get sharper in the future, and I think a human voice is also needed there.
Cool, thank you. One more question, if not? Okay, time is running short, but I'm totally aware of that. So I'm going to do a sort of a fun concluding sort of thing. Each of you, and I'm going to, rather than me, summarizing everything, I would like to pass the task to each of you. And your biggest learning today from the discussion, and no more than 2 points. Please be sharp and concise. Let me start with Lachlan.
So I think for me, my biggest takeaway is around AWDO, and something that Steve said. It was because of Mark's leadership. AWDO is not static. We want to continually improve it. We want to continually make it better. Sub-regional assessments have been talked about, climate change, incorporating the WISE scales or something similar, or a human element. All of those things are really exciting, and I'm looking forward to AWDO 2025.
Thank you. Sarah.
Yeah, I've appreciated seeing the tension between getting really comparable data on the drivers of water security or insecurity, depending if you're feeling optimistic or positive or negative. So getting what those are, but then also understanding what the current state is, and in a way that is believable. I mean, looking at the nation is something different than looking at the city, than looking at the neighborhood. So if there's this need for like simple data that people believe in and that people can go out and even collect themselves. And we haven't talked so much about that, but there's tension, but it's like a healthy tension, and it seems like one that we're all engaging.
Great point. Thank you. Charlotte.
I think it's very interesting to see the differences and similarities in the approaches. And I mean, I don't want to say that we only do quantitative work and that I only do quantitative work. I look like some kind of data Nazi, but that is not the case. You know, I think, you know, it's so challenging, right? We're talking about so many different aspects of water security or insecurity, if you want to put it that way. But we have to start somewhere. And I think, you know, the best thing that we can do is probably to try to, you know, work together more and build on what's already there. Like, that's why we used AWDO. We didn't want to start from something completely different. And, you know, we should look at ways to try to maybe incorporate the qualitative data into the quantitative data and to keep it simple so that, you know, everyone can understand it. If a policymaker can't understand it, just a regular citizen on the ground is not going to understand it either. So yeah, that would be my takeaway.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Toshio Koita.
Okay, I think the AWDO 2025, I strongly recommend it includes the climate change impact explicitly in a wide scale by combining wide scale something, and to implement the action based on this AWDO, we need to establish some action platform, and also the integrated knowledge should be introduced through the function of the facilitator, and end-to-end the approach should be established. That is my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the great takeaways, and I cannot possibly do a better job to summarize all the rich content and discussion today. So thank you so much. Now it's my privilege and honor to invite Dr. Thomas Panilla, Director, Environment, Natural Resources and the Agriculture Division, East Asia Development Department of ADB, to give us his concluding remarks. Thomas, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And apologies, I came in a bit late and had a sick child all night, and but I'm here. And anyway, so first I would like to reiterate my deep appreciation for Mark and what he contributed to the latest edition of AWDO and the thought leadership. And I think we really took it up a notch. Also, I think, as everyone has talked about, while it's a great tool, there is still so much more to be done. In this last version, we had OECD contribute sections on finance and governance. Looking in the future, we will try to quantify inclusiveness as part of it. So it is a living document. And also had the pleasure of leading the team that put it together. And I can't tell you that the amount of just debate over, I don't want to say trivial things, but very important things on how we measure what water security is, and quantify that. And it may not be a perfect science, and it won't ever be a perfect science. But the thing is, we are having this discussion. There are ways to improve it. I totally support Koike-san's remarks on climate change and having it being a forward-looking document, as well as having it more accessible to people. I mean, the problem with JMP data is, well, it's AWDO 2020, but really it's AWDO 2018-17 because we're using old data sets. So I think if we can get something out there that, one, allows people to put in their own data sets, to one, bring it to current just the current status of things, but also to make it a tool that can be interactive. And this is things we've talked about where local policymakers can use it, put in their data. They could also run some scenarios as big games, as we called it, to make it a bit more usable as a policy and an investment tool. And I know you had the case from Thailand, you had the case from Karnataka. It was also used in the Yellow River Basin, and actually ended up with an investment plan based on the findings from AWDO. So, well, I'm very partial to AWDO simply because I've been involved ever since its inception in 2007. I just think these tools, whether it's AWDO or not, are critical to, one, bring data and evidence-based, factual statistics into decision-making, but at the same time, let's make that accessible to not only decision makers, but just interested people online, because there are many people who want to use AWDO type of data to look at their current situation. And I think like any tool such as cost benefit analysis, anything, having data, having the ability to manipulate this data, look at scenarios, and will help drive better decision making into the future as water becomes more and more precious. The trade-offs need to be weighed, not just scientifically, but water is always a political decision. Let's be straight about that, and help that. The inclusivity also, I think, is important. People talked about gender. I think the one thing that came out was in KD 5 on disaster risk management. It was shown that women and girls suffered far more from natural disasters from water. So it's not just access to water, it's really all aspects of the water and the way we're measuring it with AWDO, where it's quite clear that women and girls need to have this evidence base to make sure that they can have a better life, a better future, and that planning can be integrated into both how water is managed, but also investment decisions. And I think that's an important part. We're a bank, but let's make better investment decisions that benefit people, yet at the same time minimize the amount of resources that are needed for achieving very sustainable water outcomes. And on the finance side, again, I think the private sector needs much more attention, and hopefully that's something that we can look at going forward into AWDO 2025. Again, would like to appreciate all our partners who supported us, the IWC team, EMI, the Korean Construction Consortium, and who am I missing here, Steve?
I think
I
you've
don't
got.
I think I got them all. But I would also be happy to make it also a much more inclusive document going forward. With it would be time consuming and tedious, and some countries need to get government sign off on AWDO, and but also just to make it a more participatory type of process that again comes back to that ownership that Lachlan was talking about, not only in the methodology, but in the data, so people can take it home, they can use it in their own communities, and they can also take it to a scale of granularity at the basin, catchment, city level, which may produce far more meaningful outcomes in terms of policy making. I think I'll stop there. I've said enough. But again, I just want to thank the team. And I also just want to express my heartfelt grief and hope, as Cheng-Hua so eloquently put, about Mark's legacy in the water sector, because he was a giant of a man in many ways. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much for the great discussion, and thank you for all the listeners to tune in. And I hope that you will find this session very constructive, productive, and valuable to you, to your work as well. I would like to end this panel discussion today by commemorating Mark Pascoe with a saying that I spotted today when I was, hiking in the wood. It's about a fallen log. It says like this: a fallen log is really the forerunner of future forest, and it enriches the soil so that other plants may grow. Dear Mark, thank you so much for everything. And now you can rest in peace and love in heaven, and God bless. Thank you very much. Thank you again for all the panelists. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My